Paul Hartnell from Orbital will say that he does what he does largely because the Radiophonic Workshop did Doctor Who. It is all sort of passing of the baton, which brings us to capturing the atmosphere and ethos of what happened in this building and putting it all into a sample library. And I think that's interesting on a historical level, as well as being very interesting in that we're creating or making a creative tool at the same time. Well, here we are, Studio 2 at Maida Vale. Haven't been here for a while. Radiophonic Workshop started here in 1958.
I can only remember mythical stories. I wasn't here, of course. As far as I remember, you might be able to check the details for me, Desmond Briscoe and Daphne Oram, both studio managers in Broadcasting House, and both interested in what was going on in electronic music, particularly on the continent, and both interested in creating different sounds and things for radio. At the same time as they had that interest, there were new scripts being provided, scripts which were challenging. They weren't just standard day-to-day scripts. They were scripts which were quite challenging in their way of using inner space, perhaps even outer space. Taking the initiative, I suppose, and doing stuff on tapes and playing it to the producers and saying, look, what do you think about this? And having an open mind producer, he said, I quite like that, let's have it, let's use it. So it came about, I often describe it as quite by accident, almost by accident.
But there wasn't any budget.
No.
There was no department. This wasn't even a department. And I think they had to beg, steal and borrow, literally start off with equipment that nobody else wanted. And even when I first came to the workshop, there were still one or two bits of equipment left from those early days. Right. And they were ancient, absolutely ancient. And they never really bought anything for a long time, did they? There wasn't.
They started at Broadcasting House, but at some point they must have migrated to here in Maida Vale, mustn't they?
Yes.
I'm not quite sure how that happened.
No, I don't know that. It's probably based on the fact that some people thought the further away they were, the better.
I think I've heard that description. Yes.
I think the problem was that they were raiding other studios in Broadcasting House overnight and borrowing all the gear.
Yes.
Because, of course, at that time, they used to play the national anthem at 11 o'clock at night. We went to bed until the news came on at 6 in the morning. So
That's
the
right.
studios shut down.
That's true, yes. And they broke in, but they went back into the studios and
had to remember to put all the studios back together in time for the news the next morning. And I think eventually the management said, no, well, this is getting silly. You're actually doing quite useful work. There's 2 rooms at Maida Vale nobody else wants. So there you go.
Oh, right, yeah. And I think it probably was a lucky break, really, because it's actually quite a good location because you're in between Broadcasting House and Television Centre. Certainly in later years, that was really useful because it was a sort of stopping off point for directors.
And also, some of the producers that they were working with in radio perhaps migrated to television and realised the even bigger potential for radiophonic electronic music in the scores for films, even more than radio.
And clearly that was how Verity Lambert must have actually sort of thought of using us for Doctor Who.
And of course, Quatermass in the Pit was done pretty much as an opening project here.
Yes.
But, so, Glynis, you were first through the door, as it were. What did you find when you got here? What was the gear? What was the kit? What did you have to work with?
I was ushered into room 12, I think it was, and there was a VCS 3, and there were 3 reel-to-reel tape machines, and there were certain rather large objects with big dials like that, which didn't seem to respond unless you had 2 hands on it. And then I was just given a script of Welsh poems and asked to write the background music, please. Gosh. Bye. I used the VCS 3 really as source material because even at its best, it wasn't a very sophisticated instrument, and everything that came out of it sounded really raw, whatever you did to it. So I just use it as a sound source, really. Or you can modulate, you could play things through it, you could modulate sounds through it. So,
but I mean that approach was really what was the attraction in those days, was the fact that you were finding out how to do things.
Yeah.
And if in fact it had been a qualification that you read each manual through every page of a manual before you actually touched anything, the workshop would never have been the same. It was the fact that we didn't know how to use stuff that actually, gave rise to original things happening.
Yeah, because really everybody developed their own instrument. I mean, it just was a very tactile thing. I think if you're a musician, if you play an instrument, it's quite important, the sort of tactile feel of what you're doing. And to me, that was quite important.
Yes,
I didn't want to be too far away from that by just programming stuff.
So did you feel you were very much thrown in at the deep end? Here's some toys, see what you can do?
Well, I was quite happy with it, yes. I mean, I think if somebody stood over me and told me what to do, I might not have been so happy about it. I was quite happy busking it, really, because it's just so amazing. I mean, when I look back on it, I'm amazed I took to it like that. I mean, nothing I'd ever done before was anything like it.
That was very much what set the Radiophonic Workshop, for instance, apart from the European studios, because the European studios were set up as art music studios, where the great and the good would be invited in to collaborate on a new piece of art music, be it Pierre-Henri Schaeffer in France or Stockhausen in Cologne, whereas the Radiophonic Workshop was set up very much as a department to provide musical and sound accompaniment to radio and television programmes.
Yes, I was like Pete. I wanted to go and work for the BBC when I was a student, and that's what I did. So I was very happy to do it, and it was a very good environment to be working in those days.
Yeah, that brings us to the fact that one of the crucial things was your relationship with your customer.
Yeah.
Usually a radio or a TV producer who was probably got a fairly open mind, perhaps themselves didn't know quite exactly what they wanted.
Oh, no, they
so
didn't.
it was the briefing, the initial briefing was such a crucial
absolutely crucial,
thing in the whole process.
Yes.
And you would try and explore this person's mind. And I've got some wonderful stories and anecdotes about requests from producers like, I want a sound that nobody has ever heard before. I'll have to think about that. I said, what about two very interesting sounds and put them together, meld them together? That sounds like a promising recipe for a new sound that nobody has heard before.
Yeah, absolutely.
And quite often they were fooled by this.
And that works. That definitely works.
Quite often, yes, that's right.
Although having said that I'm a terrible sight reader, I have actually got a collection of orchestral scores. I was intrigued by how somebody like Stravinsky got effects by combining instruments together. I think that, a hybrid sound is a new sound, really.
Oh, yeah.
And you still hear them. You still hear some really well-produced, contemporary music.
Especially in film music. I mean, in Goldsmith's...
It's sometimes amazing, yes.
Goldsmith sounds, look at some of his scores, he combines, say, vibes and piano and a really hard hit with hard mallets. And it is a new sound. You have to look it up and see how it's orchestrated. Yeah. Roger, you arrived, I suppose, at a bit of a time of change, didn't you?
I guess I did, yes. Up until the time that I arrived, about 73, the workshop had really been a place where tape manipulation was the order of the day, and some wonderful work had been done. But in the background was the fact that there were new instruments arriving, particularly the VCS3 and its big brother, the Delaware.
Synthi 100.
And that's right. And originally the VCS3 was just a source of sound, but somehow or other we worked out a way of adding a keyboard to it so you can then be a keyboard instrument. I've always been a keyboard player, so I leapt at the chance of doing that. And another wonderful instrument that arrived was the ARP Odyssey. I don't know when it arrived, perhaps a bit later. But those two instruments, and particularly the idea of using multi-track tape machines rather than a series of 4, perhaps, 1/4 inches and keeping your fingers crossed that they'd stay in sync.
But we are looking at a history, but a lot of what you're doing was pioneering new uses of technology. I mean, what you did with the digital studio was very advanced for its time. Did any of you feel at the time that what you were doing was going to go down in history as it has, as pioneering uses of equipment and technology? Or I imagine it was just a job you were doing, but what did you feel at the time?
For me, it was just a job at the time, and posterity can look after itself. And I'm still amazed today that people are interested enough to write to me and ask me questions about what was happening in 1980, particularly in relation to Doctor Who, for example. To do with the equipment, less so. But at the time, I don't think... I didn't think about posterity, did you? I thought about just getting the job done, onto the next one.
Well, certainly not all the way up until the circular studio. And I'd agree with Roger that, sometimes the deadlines were so tight and you used to move straight on to the next show immediately after the other one. So you didn't have time to bask in any sort of
We've been doing that for the last
golden
30
glow.
years,
Yeah, but I must admit, when the Circular Studio actually made the front cover of Sound on Sound, I just thought, oh, actually, I quite like that. Yes, I did actually. But up to then, no.
It was just a job, but I mean, I was aware that it was just an amazing job.
Oh, I
so
agree.
I didn't think of it just a job.
Yes.
I mean, I didn't have any pretensions about what I was doing, but I did actually take it very seriously.
And a lot of the advances were needs must, pragmatic solutions to a problem, which we look back on now and think, actually, that's blooming clever.
Yes.
But at the time, it was presumably just a pragmatic
Oh, absolutely.
decision.
And when you look at what happens now, I mean, people are actually solving problems and discovering new ways of doing things. It's just the way it works, really. But you certainly at the time don't do it because you want to be part of this great historical timeline. You're just doing it. Yes. I don't think the workshop really was very influenced by anybody else. No. Other people were influenced by us simply because we were broadcasting our stuff and they got interested in it. But the BBC at that time was very insular, and it actually was very self-sufficient. It had its own wardrobe department, its own props, everything was BBC oriented. And had a separate building for every activity all around West London. And so when it came to us and our created music and sound, it didn't really occur to us that we needed to look elsewhere. We had been asked to do something original within these walls and not to be thinking elsewhere. And so I must admit, I didn't tend to do that. And afterwards, I just feel that it must seem so strange and probably a little bit arrogant now to think that we thought we could do it all on our own,
But we just had to, because, I mean, there wasn't any time.
There wasn't much time.
And also, I mean, there were very few broadcasting organisations around the world who had anything similar. And, I mean, we were doing a very particular job. I mean, we all had our ears open.
Yes, yes. And obviously you occasionally did hear something that you really admired, but often that was like a combination thing. It might have been maybe a radio play or a television drama or something that had just a sequence in it that just rang a few bells and was really attractive, but it might not have been because it had new music in it of any sort. It might have been a combination of things, so those sort of things influenced you. But not necessarily like us looking outside.
We quite often quote the fact we've just talked about it now about Paul McCartney and Delia. Paul McCartney sought Delia out because she had this reputation, and she was a rather intriguing person, rather talented, and so he beat a path through her door. I don't know how much influence she had or her work had on his work. Similarly, other people came, like I'm told that Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones was another person that perhaps somehow or other they wanted to grab a part of the influence that Delia seemed to have around her. I don't remember anything. I don't know if that's your experience.
There is a picture of early Pink Floyd sitting in room 12. So obviously a lot of things were happening in this building.
Yes.
But that's what happened in this building, so it shouldn't be that much of a surprise for us.
No.
And as far as having an influence on things, well, take your pick, really. I can't think of anything in particular that's, that's very radiophonic. I mean, there are certain things, that you've just referred to, which perhaps somehow in the background you think to yourself, would that have happened if there hadn't been a radiophonic workshop?
You do occasionally think that, but there's absolutely no way of answering it.
Correct.
Other than anecdotally. I mean, for instance, Paul Hartnell from Orbital will say that he does what he does largely because the Radiophonic Workshop did Doctor Who. It is all sort of passing of the baton, which brings us to why we are here now, of course, which is trying to encapsulate what happened in this building, to sample the building and to use the Radiophonic Workshop ethos, archive and new work that we're doing to create a tool for the next generation to use in creating their work, a sample library. What do we feel about that?
I think it's a bold venture, And the people we've been surrounding ourselves with today, if they're anything to go by, I think they will have an enormous amount of success.
It's really nice to take a technology to produce what people would imagine was orchestral music. But this is breaking out of that mold and actually offering some truly new and creative sounds. The important thing is to try and actually come up with some really nice original sounds that still allow people to be creative with them.
I think what you were saying is right. If we can provide sounds here which can be used and manipulated and can inspire, rather than just say, that's the sound everybody's using, I think that's very exciting. And I think the discussion we've been having is exactly what we're looking at, is a set of tools and creative tools, capturing the atmosphere and ethos of what happened in this building and putting it all into a sample library. And I think that's an interesting on a historical level, as well as being very interesting in that we're creating or making a creative tool at the same time.
We're actually ensuring that these things are passed on through this system because, as we well know, it's difficult to come across reel-to-reel tape machines. I've just asked for 2 exactly the same so I can line them up and put a loop across. That is not available to everybody out there, and it's really great that they might have access to something that's made with that.
I mean, speaking personally, I'm delighted that I started my career still working on quarter-inch tape.
Yes.
Because I think tape as a physical medium for creating and preserving, manipulating sound and music can't be beaten. And I still think in very much analog terms, even as I think you do, even when I'm using digital technology.
Yes. Everybody in the room knows where the stuff is, but it's all in there. It's not all around you, and we can all vouch for the fact when we first came to the workshop, what was really startling was that there was all this stuff all around, and it was a physical place where you would make a sound,
And the stuff was tools with which you could work.
Yes.
And I think that's something that Spitfire are doing, is creating tools for composers to use. And I think that's, I think
so
that's very
hopefully
important.
we're coming full circle, yeah.